Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our fourth session today on Tech Community Live. We've had a lot of great sessions. I'm on screen for some of them. I'm in the background for some of them, but I see a lot of you coming from session to session to session. So thank you so much for your support and for asking us all the great questions that you're asking us. My name is Joe Lurie. I always start this by saying I'm literally the least important person in the room, and that is always the case. Today, I'm here with three of my teammates. We're all on the same team. We're all on a team called the Customer Acceleration Team. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Perla.
Hello, everyone. My name is Perla Morales. I am part of the CAT team. I've been doing Intune work for the past 6 years, and I'm so excited to be here and answer any questions.
Cool. And I am Neil Johnson. Hi, everybody. I have been in Intune since 2016, and I focus on everything that's not Windows.
And I'm John Callahan. I'm also part of the same CAT team as the rest of the folks, and I've been with Microsoft for about 12 years and a part of Intune for 5. And I focus on mostly Windows, but just about everything.
I think John just hit his 12-year anniversary, so happy anniversary, John.
Apparently, yeah.
We've got a lot of great questions, so we're going to start right away. The first question, we're moving thousands of devices to Intune from a third-party MDM provider. I'm missing a quick console that reflects the status of devices in real time. 2 to 3 minute delay could be acceptable. But when you're enrolling devices and you see MDM is deploying some apps and configs, it doesn't appear in the console after 10 or more minutes. Several times when you're testing, you don't know if it's working, if it's fine, if the console is not updated. Neil, what do you think about the delay that we might see when enrolling a new device, whether that is Windows or a Mac device, or when the delay that they see when they're enrolling a new device?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's a really good question, actually. And it's one of those things that comes up in deployment and migrations, but it's rarely something that comes up in like business as usual, right? So once your environment is up and running, it's not the kind of thing that you are focused on. So we tend to hear this from our customers that are onboarding lots of devices or just trying to design solutions. And it can be tricky. We would hope that it was quicker than 10 minutes. But I think we'd agree that sometimes it's not as quick as we would like. There are some things that you can do, though. So typically, the device itself will update more quickly than the Intune console. So if you go into settings and have a look in the profiles on the device, you can see the exact state in real time. That's pretty much across all of the platforms. I'm not super familiar with Windows, so I don't know where you do it in Windows, but I do know on Mac and iOS and on Android, we can see that reasonably quickly on the device without waiting for the Intune console. The other tip is to use Graph. So if you're familiar with Graph and PowerShell, or even just the Graph Explorer, that normally updates reasonably quickly. So that updates a lot more quickly than the Intune UI does. So we do have some strategic investments in this space to improve the Intune UI too. So hopefully, if you came back to us in a year's time, we perhaps wouldn't, fingers crossed, right, we wouldn't be having the same conversation. So we're kind of hoping to improve the UI speed. But for right now, checking on the device and using Graph is probably, that's the way I tend to do it anyway. I don't know whether you guys have got anything to add to that.
It's a good point to use Graph. In the troubleshooting AMA that we had about 2 hours ago, or if you're watching this recording, 2 recordings ago, Dave Randall gave some great tips on using Graph and seeing what is the Graph call that I need. So you start running something in the console and hit F12 in the browser so you can see what's happening. And go back and watch that if you haven't seen it, just so you can get some good Graph tips. But yeah, Neil, I agree. On the device, including Windows devices, you can see that in settings as well relatively quickly. Perla or John, do you have any comments on that as well?
Just underscore what Neil said. It's feedback we hear a lot in the lab, in the testing phase, but at production, typically there's so many things going on. The status taking 5 minutes instead of 3 minutes doesn't tend to be a big issue. But we do hear that in that lab and that testing phase, and I'll sympathize. It can be frustrating when you know that the app is installed, but you don't see that reflected in the console. But it should update, and things do chug along very well once you are doing this outside of your lab and in the real world conditions.
Thanks, John. We got a question from Sebastian, which is it's a great question. John, I'm going to throw this over to you first. Is there any chance to get hybrid Azure AD or AD account passwordless without paying? IT security sees difficulties as long as it's still possible to use a password on cloud managed devices, because the password could be used worldwide to use cloud services. But for now, password is the backup when hello isn't working as expected. What could be a way around this? We're trying to go passwordless.
Yeah, so I will say that this is probably a question better for our Intra ID folks, but I can share some of what I've experienced with this. I'm actually working with a customer that is working on eliminating passwords, and they have done what it sounds like very similar to you're doing, where Windows Hello or some sort of modern authentication method is the standard login method. In their case, they are using MFA as a requirement for all passwords, especially if you're coming in over the internet. So that's a good way to make sure that, yes, the password is still there as a backup mechanism, but it can't just be used freely without having to prove that you are indeed the person. And there's also other alternative login methods that can be used on the device. There are other options to use things like security keys to log into a Windows device if Windows Hello isn't functioning. There's also, of course, always the backfill default for Windows Hello, where you can sign in with your PIN. So if your fingerprint reader or the facial recognition feature isn't working, or that person got a different haircut and the camera's not quite recognizing them that day, there is always the PIN to fall back to. And I will say that there are some methods where you can remove providers and remove the password as an option on the device. I have heard of companies going that far, and there are ways to do it where you limit at what password providers are available. But the thing to keep in mind with that is that the password is still required around a lot of systems. It's a long journey to eliminate the passwords. So I would say just make sure that you're doing all the identity best practices, like enabling MFA, making sure that strong passwords are there, so that yes, it is there as a default, but some of those concerns are lesser because you're not using it as the primary login. And if it is used, there's things like MFA to prevent that.
And I'd also add on to that to say conditional access. So, Sebastian, your point is that if someone else is using that password, they could be on any device anywhere in the world, and that's what conditional access can kind of protect you as well. It'll protect the device that it's on if the device isn't healthy, or if it's a geo that's not typically where that user logs in from, or if the user account itself has been flagged as unhealthy in Entra ID or Azure AD, as it was formerly known. Mm-hmm. Conditional access can help protect as well in that case. The other thing I was going to add is I was working with a customer late last year who they've been passwordless forever. They said they've been passwordless for at least a decade. And one thing that they had been waiting for was temporary access pass to be supported in Autopilot. And 2301 Intune release, so earlier this year, we support TAP, temporary access pass. So with temporary access pass, again, it's not a password, it's a passwordless solution, allowing you to complete the Windows Autopilot provisioning and then provision into Hello for Business, like as John was saying. And you'll have a password, but you'll never even know it. You'll never even use it.
Definitely. This definitely adds to our zero trust story model using Intune, MFA, and also going the passwordless route specifically for the future in enterprises. And it's really exciting to see the moving forward.
And Neil, as customers are moving here, I know Sebastian's question was about Windows devices, it appears, when you're talking about Azure AD joint. But we're also, Mac added single sign-on, which isn't passwordless, but it prevents you from needing to enter your password a lot of times. If you want to talk about the single sign-on stuff that we're doing with Mac devices as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we do support passwordless on Mac too,
Mhm.
which works great. So if anyone's seen me demoing our current Mac stack, I'll always tend to do that with passwordless auth. I think that's a desire across it. I think it's platform agnostic, right? I don't think anybody's saying, "Hey, I only want passwordless on Windows," right? I think it's just, "Hey, it doesn't matter which device it is. I don't want my end users to be having to deal with passwords. I don't want passwords on sticky notes everywhere. We've all seen that, right? And so passwordless seems to work great. I mean, I a volunteer for a local charity, and they were mind blown when I showed them passwordless auth. Right? They were just, this is the best thing ever. Their passwords were 4 characters long in many cases, right? So not only did we make life easier for them, but made them significantly more secure. Like you mentioned, conditional access. Having MFA, having really bringing that whole suite of stuff we get from Azure AD, or Entra, I should say. Now that's going to take a long time to unlearn. But yeah, it makes a big difference. It's that combination of end user experience and security working really, really well. I think it's one of those cases where there's no downside to it. So yeah, absolutely great. And with Platform SSO on Mac, it's a pretty great experience right now. So we're really pleased. We're quite pleased with where we are.
Yeah, it's awesome. And we talked a little bit about that in the last session. We were talking about managing Mac OS devices. Andy and Arnav were talking about that platform SSO and some of the things you're talking about. So again, if you haven't gotten a chance to review that session, go back and watch that session as well. It was a great session. We got another question from Jamie, and I wish Dano was here to answer this one. I sort of know the answer, I think, but we have a question from Jamie. Are we able to request a bump? And let me just start saying you can always request. Right? There's lots of ways to request. One way is the send a smile, send a frown in the Intune console. You can, which is they get a summary of these things. The project managers, the product managers and program managers, they get a summary weekly of all the smileys and frowns. Please send smileys. They like those as well. And of course, aka.ms Intune feedback. You can always request. Now to Jamie's question. Are we able to request a bump to the 10 custom ADMX file limit in Intune? John, have you talked to Dano about that recently, by any chance?
To be honest, I haven't. I know that the limit exists, and like you said, we love the feedback that limit might be a problem for you, especially understanding of what your business scenarios are. There's some case to be made to prioritize that, and your reasons for why. Maybe you have lots of third-party applications that you're uploading custom ADMXs for. That would be really good for us to know. Or maybe you're writing your own custom ADMX policies, and if that's what you're doing, we really want to know what you're doing with those. That's something we have hoped to see, is that leveraging the platform that way. But it's also things that if you're doing custom things, we'd like to know. Those are interesting things to learn, and maybe things that we can bake into the product one day, so that you didn't have to write that custom ADMX.
It's cool that you mentioned writing a custom ADMX, or even just Jamie's question, because Chrome ADMX was very commonly imported, and really you don't have to do that because the Chrome settings are in our settings catalog, so you no longer need a custom ADMX.
Yeah, and that's actually a great example of that feedback coming back, because we started hearing the request for Chrome so much that we realized every customer basically needs the Chrome ADMX policy. So we worked with Google as a partner to get those ADMX policies directly within Intune, so that every customer doesn't have to do the exact same thing over and over. But I would encourage you to put in a support case if that 10 limit is posing problems for you, and we'll take that feedback. And I can't make any promises, but please share the feedback. And Joe, I know you said you might know something on this, so you might be more up to date than I am.
I don't know. Last time I talked to Dano was well over a year ago, and there was always the intent to increase the limit. He was still working, investigating what that limit could be. It's storage. It's a lot of things involved in the back end of that.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like a lot of the things that we do in Intune seem like really easy arbitrary limits. Why is there only 10? Well, the answer is probably because it's very complicated to make it more than 10. There's a lot of investment and trade-offs that would have to take place. And that's where understanding your business cases on why you need more than 10 can help us, because you might actually come to us with a reason that says, oh, this actually is a higher priority than what we're working on right now. And we may be able to adjust resources based on that. So like Joe said, we thrive on feedback. Give us those smiles, give us those frowny faces. Share it with your account teams through support, whatever avenues you have to reach to us. Let us know, because your feedback matters, and that does help us prioritize things like this. And like Joe said, it is something they intend to do, but as you've seen, there's been a lot of change in Intune over the past few years with the introduction of settings catalog and the way that we're changing the way that policy administration is done within the console. And while that may seem like maybe just visual refreshes, I can tell you in the back end, it's huge, monumental changes. and Neil's laughing because it's been big changes for the Mac side too, and also some really cool scenarios that we're going to be able to light up in the future because of that. And that's work that we had to get done that unfortunately meant some work couldn't happen, at least not immediately.
Yeah, thanks, John, for that explanation. It's fun to kind of peel back, open the curtains a little bit for everyone, without giving them too much view into what all is happening. Let's move on though. So we have a question from Dylan, and I'm not sure who wants to be a licensing expert here. So a question from Dylan: for computers that only have a service account signed into them, my understanding is that to still communicate with Intune, the account needs to have a Microsoft license or an Intune license assigned to it that includes Intune, a Microsoft 365 or an Intune license. Is there a concern with licensing when doing this for multiple computers but using the same service account? So I'm going to actually stop there for a second, because there are different licensing packages available, whether it's a EMS license, a Microsoft 365 license, and then break that down to, I would say that an account that will only ever have a service account, or a computer that only has a service account, maybe an F3 or a frontline license is probably the right license depending on the scenario in which it's being used. So I'm gonna table the question for a second just to talk about it depends, because it depends on the type of license you're assigning, whether it's EMS, Microsoft 365, E3, A3, F3, F1, right? There's a lot of different E5, F5 licenses that could be. So is there a concern with licensing when doing this for multiple computers but using the same service account? During testing, we assign the service account the Intune Plan 1 license or device license. Is it a license issue to scale this to utilize this account for 100 or 100 plus devices? And so first, Neil, because I saw you a little bit nod.
I think that this is so from memory, and this is I'm not a license expert by any means. This is something I run from. The licensing is too complicated, but I think device licenses were always intended to be per device. So you've got, I think, a few options here. The device licenses were created for this scenario, and obviously we've got a standard suite of licenses, whether that be for Intune only or for M365 and the kind of the services and suites and the various variations they offer. But from a device perspective, these were created where you needed to license Intune on the device, but you didn't necessarily need M365 type services on there. So I think you would need 100 of these, but it wouldn't take a great deal for someone to convince me otherwise. But that's what I think you need. I think you'd need to license each device. So.
I will add that Neil's correct. It is a one-to-one relationship for a license per device if you're using the Intune device license. So in this case, I think it is pretty safe to say that you would need that many licenses, but something I'm going to say here is that the technical implementation and the actual licensing requirements are very different. You need to have enough licenses to cover your usage. That is simple enough to say. Work with your account team and the licensing experts that the account team has access to make sure that you're covered with that. But the way that things are technically enforced can be different than the way that the licensing terms actually read. So make sure that you're, both technically working, but also valid with the licensing requirements. And that's where I would really encourage you to make sure you're working with your teams from within Microsoft to make sure that you're in compliance with those things. And they're super knowledgeable about this stuff. It's very complicated, but they're also going to be able to work with you to figure out the right mix for you to be in compliance, which again may be different than what you technically have to do to make it work.
And the account team also works with you and your enterprise to make sure that your needs and it fits that license exactly with what you need. They might even have best recommendation or best practices, and they're always in contact with the licensing and product team to make it work for you.
Yeah, one thing that John had mentioned was you have to be licensed for usage. If you have a device license, it doesn't really matter who logs into it. But if you have a user, we have 30 different users that might log into a device and you're using user-based licenses, all 30 of them do need to be licensed. So it's really, we want to make sure, the four of us here, way, I guess, of us want to make sure that you stay in license compliance. And so we're all on the engineering team, not the sales, not the licensing team. And so it's hard for us to give a 100%, we know that this is fact answer, but your account teams or even calling Microsoft would be probably a better option there. We have a question from Aaron with the scenario and then the question. So I'll read the context first. The context is about RBAC, so role-based access control. Currently planning to use Intune with a distributed RBAC model. My team will provision access for other groups or departments who want to use Intune for managing their own devices. The problem that we foresee is with group management. If someone from one of these departments wants to assign apps or policies to a smaller subset of their scope group, they will need the ability to configure scope groups for their own role assignment. So the question, what's the best way to accomplish this? I just scrolled too fast. What's the best way to accomplish this without granting them the Intune administrator role? We considered using device categories, but creating those requires the Intune admin or the global admin role. So in this case, it looks like they're trying to create scope groups, and they're looking for an RBAC to create scope groups. Aaron, I think that's a summary of what you're asking. What's the best way to create, what role is the best one to create a scope group?
From initial drafting and thinking, it would be creating an administrative role or a custom role specifically and adding a scope tag in which then you are able to identify the administrators. So it'll be the administrators that are going to administrate that specific group. And then from there, you could also then have specific roles in terms of applying applications to certain groups. And then you could even filter it with the filtering mode within those applications. So you could say group A, and then filter in, and then go ahead and add extra filters that you want to go ahead and apply that application to that specific group and narrow it down to specific devices or specific assignments you want.
Thanks, Perla. John or Neil, do you have anything to add to that?
Perla read my mind on that one.
Yeah, spot on.
Go ahead.
I would say also it's possible that yep, go ahead. No, go ahead.
For this, I would leverage the filters, assignment filters for more flexibility, and that's something that can be done outside of Azure AD groups or intra ID groups. And that can get you away from having to make so many changes to the RBAC roles so that you can add these new scope groups. And you may actually find that you're able to get a lot more flexibility out of assignment filters than you would groups within intra.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Perla. Yeah, I was going to mention that, and sometimes in Intune, sometimes you may need to have an Intune admin or a global admin or someone who has rights to subscriptions and whatnot. So getting a process together today to put in those change requests or those CAB requests for those people to create what you need to create. Intune, we have a lot of great RBAC capabilities, but not everything. Some things do still require an Intune admin role. So it's something that you might put into your processes on what to do when you need to contact that Intune admin to create what you need to create. We have some feedback from Michelle. So thank you, Michelle, for this feedback. I saw it earlier before. I think I saw this before this one began, and I want to +1 your feedback. Pretty sure this is something that if you keep your ears open, you're going to see coming available in Intune soon. But Michelle's feedback is ability to set a priority order on Intune policies like group policy. So set the order of precedence for configuration profiles, or just Intune policies. And I do think you'll see something like this in the future in Intune.
Yeah, if I could add here, this is an area where I would like to actually understand more of what you're trying to accomplish in your scenario, because as Joe said, stay tuned. There may be some things coming here, but one of the questions that we're trying to really get a firm answer on is what is the requirement for being able to do these priorities? Is it to resolve conflicts? And that maybe you configured 2 policies and you want to make sure that in the conflict you get the outcome you're looking for, or you resolve whatever the conflict is? Or are you trying to create a hierarchy and precedence to be able to configure devices almost like in a tree form, where you have maybe something here and then something here and something there, and it's really kind of the way that you're organizing devices, and you'd like to say something like the policy that's closest to that device is the one that wins, or maybe it's a policy that you want to be able to say this should always win for this group of devices or this group of users. And that kind of the reason behind why you're asking this is something that we're really curious in. And if you could share more feedback, I'd love to hear it, because it is maybe a different solution if we're looking at this from a problem and troubleshooting scenario, or if we're looking at this from an organization and a policy creation standpoint.
Yeah, it's a great point. In group policy, you set it at the local machine or the site, the domain, the OU or the sub OU. Here in Intune, you set it in Intune. And so some people that we talk to that want the priority, they want it for that reason, so that if, like group policy, I set at the site versus at the OU, this one wins, but others want it just for conflict resolution. And so getting a use case does really help us figure out how to implement what you're asking for. We have a question from Saba, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly, and I really hope so, because I've seen questions in every one of our sessions so far today. So thank you for spending your day with us. Is there any plan to implement corporate device identifiers? John, I'm going to go to you first on this. Corporate device identification for Windows devices if you are not using Autopilot. As I see currently, it's impossible to block BYOD enrollment without Autopilot being implemented. Any plan to implement any kind of corporate device identifier so that only a corporate device could be enrolled?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess my immediate question is, why are you not ready to use Autopilot? That's maybe a really good question to ask you in this. But just kind of knowing where this question comes up in the past, while we don't always like to use this as an enrollment method, it does matter how your device enrolls, and you have to be able to some way pre-declare that a device is a corporate device. Autopilot is the most direct path to doing that. There also is another path where if a device comes into Intune through either hybrid Azure AD join or co-management with Configuration Manager, that device will also be marked as a corporate device. The reason why I said it would be good to understand your block on Autopilot better is maybe it's because you're coming from hybrid Azure AD join, or you're coming from co-management with Configuration Manager. And if that's the case, there may be a way to configure your tenant so that it is happening in such a way, such as having automatic enrollment for hybrid Azure AD join, or setting up your co-management policies for your Configuration Manager site. The feedback is heard on being able to do this outside of Autopilot. And similar to what Joe said earlier, I'll just say stay tuned. We are working on some new enrollment methods. It may not be absent of autopilot, but there are some new ways coming that might be able to help you here.
Thanks, John. So we've got another question that just came in. I'm sorry, I got a little distracted reading that question in my mind before saying it. So I apologize. But when it comes to moving group policy to Intune and configuration profiles, I find many older GPOs or group policy objects have registry keys in them that are still needed. Would the path forward be converting it to PowerShell and in Intune using scripts or remediation area? First, I'm going to say we never want you to set registry keys through script because it's impossible to remember which scripts did what and which keys were set which way. We want you to use CSPs. We want to use, in the old days, group policy to set your script. So I'm going to say in the beginning, right away, I'm going to say, would the path forward be converting to PowerShell and using a script? No, not to set a registry key. John, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I'm going to say this actually goes back to an answer for an earlier question. This is something that we're seeing customers use custom ADMX policies for, is being able to set these custom registry keys, and that being kind of one of the first methods to be able to set a reg key. It's also an area we're looking at where we have to work with our partners in the Windows engineering team, but we are looking at ways to extend the Windows management platform MDM to be able to do things like this. That's more in the planning phase, so nothing coming soon on that front. But your feedback is appreciated in that, because that will, as the way I answered earlier, help us prioritize with Windows and being able to add this functionality to Windows and add that through Intune, because we do prefer native solutions. Now, that said, and with what Joe's answer was of not writing PowerShell scripts, I will say that is a common way to do it. If you're licensed for it, I would actually encourage you to look at not the PowerShell, just the PowerShell scripts function in Intune, but also a feature within Intune called remediations. And remediations is really great for being able to detect whether, say, that reg key exists in your detection script, and then having a remediation script that goes and writes that. And that's a little more of a, I guess, an intelligent way to be able to write these registry keys when needed, and it gets you back closer to the way that group policy would have worked, instead of just maybe blindly writing a reg key in a single file. We're instead detecting, does the situation exist where we need to write this key, and then we'll go in and write it. And the reporting that's available in remediations, we dropped the proactive. The reporting that's available in remediations is actually a little richer than what we get in just the plain PowerShell scripts. So we do find that if you're using that functionality for this, it does give you a little more flexibility in knowing that key was written, how it got there, and because it can also be done on a schedule, it's not a one-time thing like you would get with PowerShell scripts.
And the last thing I'll say on this is, I know a lot of you, and this is actually going to go into Donna's question. My comment on this last question is going to also sort of answer Donna's question. Some of you did a lot of this with group policy preferences, not just group policy, but actually GPPs. And those group policy preferences could do everything from reg key, map drive, map printer, schedule task. There's so many things you could do with that. We are looking at how to incorporate the equivalent of a group policy preference into Intune. It's, again, still an investigation. Keep your eyes out on that. So to answer the how would I set the reg key, you could do it through remediations. You could do it, again, formally proactive remediations. You could do it through a script, although it's not always the best way because it is a one-time thing. And then also, again, we're looking at how to incorporate group policy preferences into Intune, something that we are actively incorporating. So Donna, your question on mapping drives and printers for Intune devices, and this being a major blocker for you, again, these are some of the things that we're looking at. We don't know which group policy preferences will be incorporated into Intune, so I'm going to ask, I didn't get a name on the person that asked the first one, the registry key, but if you could go to our aka.ms Intune feedback, put in the feedback that you need this capability to map drives, map printers, again, set reg keys through CSP so that it's repeatable, again, like a group policy preference would be. That would be fantastic.
I also think with especially with group analytics and just making sure you're making your migration is that it's a very important step to do the cleanup on what your enterprise has done, what's outdated, and then move those policies that are currently needed all the way to Intune. So this is a great stepping stone in order to do that cleanup and advance your enterprise to a more modernized way.
Yep. Yeah, and it's maybe a good opportunity to look at what you're using these file shares for and see, could OneDrive maybe replace, if it's the H drive, the home drive for users, or maybe it's workflows that could be moved to SharePoint Online or Teams. There may be opportunities here to get your dependency off of the on-premises file shares using more modern options or cloud-based options.
And then the last thing I'll say, Donna, the second half of your question, I know I didn't read the whole question. I will, actually. How are people dealing with map drives and printers for Intune devices when they're on-prem? This is a major block for us moving to AAD, again, Entra ID, devices and not hybrid Azure AD joined for new devices in the future. I'll be honest when I say that not every setting will ever be available in Intune. There's some settings that some of you have to set that have to do with domain member, whatever that setting is, because you're still working with domains and forests and trusts, or they might be Kerberos specific for some of those applications that are still on-prem. So if you have those types of settings that just can't be moved over to Intune, again, you can be hybrid Azure AD joined. It's a architecture that we encourage. As you're moving to Intune, makes perfect sense for your existing devices to be hybrid Azure AD joined, and your new devices then to be moved into Azure AD solely.
And something else to add here is that even though there may not be a direct one-for-one functionality for group policy preferences and being able to map a drive, you can actually connect to a on-premises file share and map drives on an Azure AD joined device. That still works. There may be a little bit of setup required to make sure that all the trusts are in place. For that, I would encourage you to work with your identity, your Entra ID folks within your organization to make sure that you've met all the prereqs. But an Azure AD joined device should be able to connect to on-premises file shares, and you should be able to connect to map drives, and things like the netuse command still work.
Netuse. How about net message? Does that work anymore? No, I don't think it does.
Haven't tested
net
that.
send.
Even I remember that.
Net send, not net message. We have a question from Terry. Is there any plan, and I might need some clarification on this one. Is there any plan or alternative for Intune devices to have software pushed available, like how configuration management and config manager have done with domain machines? I'm not sure I fully understand that, because of course Intune does push software as either required or available, either way. So I'm not sure I fully get that part. So Terry, we might need you to clarify that. And then the second part of that is, I believe there's a limit on how big a software package can be with Intune, pushing larger packages, larger apps to Intune devices. There's an 8 gig limit on that. But in the console, you can open up a ticket, and we can extend that on a tenant by tenant basis. But we do have an 8 gig limit. You're absolutely correct on that one. But yeah, if you could give us a little clarity on what you're asking, and go back and reply to your own message and with some clarity, and we'll be glad to either answer it here this way, or someone will answer it in the chat. I have a question for Neil. He's been a little quiet lately, so we went fishing for a Neil question on Windows. This is from, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Dania. Can we use Intune to prevent or get rid of widgets for iOS devices?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we can do this in MAM. So there's MAM policy controls that let us do this. I don't believe there's anything in the platform itself, though. I think it's a long-standing ask of Apple to do that. I'm curious about the reason to get rid of them here as well, because they're great, right? End users love them. People absolutely love widgets. It's usually the security teams that dislike widgets, because they've got this perception that they are just leaking corporate data everywhere. So I'm curious why to disable them. So, but yeah, you can do it by MAM today. If you go into your MAM policies, you can do that.
Thanks, Neil. And Stefan's asking, while we have Neil here, is there a way to filter a Mac OS app deployment based on the CPU type, whether it's ARM or Intel? Is there a way that we can filter that?
This is a brilliant question, and it's been a long-standing request of mine of our lovely filters team since the original Apple Silicon devices came through. This one is really interesting in that we don't see a lot of requests for this. It seems like a really obvious thing that applications will be built for either ARM or Intel, but actually in most cases they're universal. So you get a single binary essentially from most app vendors. Most organizations now are pretty skilled with this and are creating a single package that will work on both. But we are aware that that's not the case for all of them. So currently you cannot do that. There's no way for you to do this in Intune. We desperately want a filter to do that. So you can help by sending us some feedback using the little frowny icon. And I'd say that you would all love that filter to be there. If it's something you desperately need to do, I wrote a blog on the customer success blog, which talks about deploying apps via shell script for Mac. And currently, this is the way we do that. We put that binary either on Azure Blob Storage, or we pull it from wherever the source is for that PKG. And then essentially we have some logic in the beginning of that shell script, which says, am I on an Intel machine? Am I on an ARM machine? And then it goes and installs the correct binary. So it would be so much easier and quicker if we had that filter. So please send feedback to the team.
Please send feedback, absolutely. You see the same thing in Windows. I'm just going to use the Windows Store as an example. You download one application and either it's available for ARM or for Intel, it doesn't matter. It's still the one application that's going to come down from the store and just install properly. There's logic in that application to install. We do see the same thing. I know you're non-Windows, but I'm just throwing out there that we see the same thing in Windows as well.
It's been really interesting because I think Apple Silicon has grown. Nobody really anticipated the growth that we've seen. So, almost all of the Macs that we see managed now are ARM and not Intel. So it's a problem that we think will disappear, right? It's not a problem that we think is going to be around for that long, but it's still an issue. And we have the data in Intune. It's not like we don't have it. We have the architecture in Intune on the device. So it is something that we could do. And I just wish we would. So please feedback.
That's awesome. So we're looking at some other questions. I see a question that came in from Danae as well for executable file types that do not download well in SharePoint, OneDrive. Is there a recommendation, like for our administrators and their favorite tools? How do we recommend deploying, and I'm going to assume this is Windows at this point, but Windows apps to these devices if they don't really download well, if the executables don't download well? John?
I'm not sure I understand the question. They don't upload or download well from where?
Yeah, I was thinking that as I was looking at it, if they meant during the installation.
Yeah. So I will. Thinking back to many customer experiences, this is triggering a war story where a customer, actually many customers, have rules on their firewalls and their proxies and DLP software, data loss prevention, that might conflict with Intune, that are doing things like modifying the executables or ripping them out or blocking them. And so I always encourage, when weird things happen with downloads or uploads, or maybe you're not getting status, to go back to, I think, our very first question. Oftentimes, if you go and look at the Intune network requirements, and you go back to your networking team and have a look at what's being blocked on the firewall or being blocked at your proxy layer, you'll see one of those URLs that were on our list that's required for Intune to function being blocked. And on Windows, it can be very complicated because there's both the user session and then there's the computer system account session. And sometimes you have to unblock it for both of those. And so when weird things happen where you can't upload or download, or you're not getting status, or just
A
other
sync
kind of
issue.
sync issues, or just other mysteries of the unexplained, one of my first things is to always go back to the network requirements document and make sure that you've got all those things allowed.
And then blame DNS, because it's DNS anyway.
It's always DNS.
It's always DNS. Yeah.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. I actually am not paying that close attention to the clock, but I think we have time for maybe one more question. This one's from Derek, and it's kind of a longer question. What is the best practice to handle security groups, either user or computer, to order and assign them to applications and policies? We are creating dynamic groups based on job title to automatically assign a user to a group, and then assigning those groups to applications or the policies that are associated to the groups to have. Would this be recommended, or would you suggest another way to create groups and associate them to applications and policies? In other words, do you recommend dynamic groups? Do you recommend static groups? What's the recommendation? Neil, I'll start with you.
No, I do not like dynamic groups at all. I've worked many. They're unpredictable. This is the problem with dynamic groups. So I think the theory behind them, the philosophy of dynamic groups, is excellent. And I've seen a number of customers work with dynamic groups in test environments and POCs and got their environment working just the way they want, and they're really happy. And then they go into production, and then you get the phone call saying, hey, it's taking 24 hours for my group to update. There's something broken. And then you go and look at the SLA on the Azure AD side, and I think it's 48 hours. It used to be 24. I think it's going up even longer. So, yes, they do work. Yes, they can be really, really great. The problem, though, is that they can be really unpredictable. So I tend to use them as a last resort, right? I'll do everything I possibly can. I normally start with direct assignments. I'll use filters. If there's no other way of doing this, then I'll use a dynamic device group. But yeah, they're not my favorite things, and it's just because of the unpredictability. You will get times where they don't populate when you expect.
Neil, what about user dynamic groups? Do you see the same level of apprehension for those?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing, again, it's the same problem, right? Where it's actually not in BAU that you see the problem. So in business as usual, I don't see them being an issue. It's in onboarding. It's that onboarding flow where you've got somebody that's their first day on the job. They unwrap their device. They go into the environment. And as their device enrolls, that user group is then being added to the various groups. If it can be populated upfront, that's kind of okay. But like a day ahead, you're okay. But with things like dynamic device groups, they are notoriously bad. User groups, a little bit less, but again, it depends on what you are filtering on. If you're, how that user is being added to the groups. If it's done way ahead, and you can get that user in the right groups before they enroll, I think you're good. But not for devices, definitely.
Maybe we can get the link and put it here in the banner. There was a great blog written maybe a year or so ago by one of our product managers, Scott Duffy, on some of the recommended practices around groups and some of the challenges around dynamic groups and where you can leverage filters. And so we'll see if we can get that in the banner so that you can go and check that out, because I think that is going to have a lot of answers for you in that blog. And then another kind of suggestion that I'll have here that's maybe subtext in what you asked, and maybe not directly answering the question and answering it with another question, but something I always encourage customers, especially as they're moving from on-prem to Intune, is rethinking about the way that you assign your applications, especially if you're in a world where maybe you're doing all of your assignments as required and likely also targeting the computer object. If you're doing that, now is a great time to rethink, can we target users instead? And can we also use available assignments instead of required assignments? And doing that oftentimes gets you out of a lot of extra overhead of managing all these complex mappings, and this department requires this app, but this app has to be available. Well, maybe you can take a step back and make more things available, and embrace the user going into the company portal and using it like the app store that they're used to on their phones. The company portal is great. Let them go and shop. And there's the blog. Thank you.
It is. I think to add to that, though, I think the feedback that I've seen from customers where we've done that and moved more apps to available is the end users are happier typically, right? They're usually much happier having control over what gets installed on their device than someone in IT guesses what they need and pushes a bunch of stuff. So,
or having to go and open a help desk ticket. Everyone hates opening help desk tickets.
Yeah. So normally the question is, how do I remove? Like, how do I get rid of this app, right? Whereas if it's available, they get to choose.
Yeah.
So.
I think we have one last question. It's going to be from Jonathan. Thank you, by the way, Neil and John, for your guidance there. This is another guidance question. And this is a funny one because it's what's the best practice on doing something that we allow you to do 5 different ways? Whichever of the 5 ways works for you is typically the guidance. But so the question that Jonathan's asking, is there any guidance on which Intune policy type is recommended for use when there are multiple ways to do something? For example, Microsoft's own documentation on enabling network protection has 3 different methods to do so: defender for endpoint, baselines, antivirus, policy method, configuration profile method. And again, I know BitLocker has several ways to enable BitLocker in Intune. What's our guidance on that? When we have so many ways to do things, what's the guidance? And I'm going to also, before you answer, say there's sometimes you can do something in Azure or Intune, or you can do it in MDE or in Intune. And typically it's the same thing. When you set it in Intune, it's actually being set in the other places at the same, but we're just surfacing the node in the Intune console. But you're actually writing to the MDE or to Azure. But what would you say is the guidance there when there's so many ways to do something? The best way to do it? Perla, we'll start with you.
All over, isn't it? We've always done this in that.
I would say, like, in terms when it comes down to the baselines within Intune, that will be my last resort, given that we have other ways to go ahead and start deploying those policies specifically. The baselines are usually used if you're like on a starting basis and you're starting to build your security protocols within your enterprise. So that will be like, hey, like think about that doing last. Different other policies configuration, it's what works for you, and it definitely depends. I don't know if Neil and John have like other insights as well.
Yes, I was just thinking it depends is the real answer here. But I think a more concrete answer is it really does depend on your scenario. If you're configuring security policies, then that endpoint security blade is probably the right place to start. It has what really are pre-configured templates for the most used settings for antivirus or the most used settings for firewall or BitLocker. And yes, you may be able to find that same BitLocker policy over in settings catalog, but if endpoint security has the settings you need and they're all there available without you having to search all around the console, I would encourage you to use that. Now, if your scenario requires you to configure some very kind of non-standard settings and policies and you can't find an endpoint security, then that may be when you need to go to settings catalog. One thing I can say that's pretty much almost a rule is if you find it in settings catalog, use settings catalog before something like templates. If you find it in there, you're going to have a much better experience with the settings catalog. And long term, that is our direction, is towards the settings catalog. And like in Intune, you will find still settings to configure the old Microsoft Edge Spartan. Those are only in templates. You won't find it in settings catalogs. I don't think you will. And that's a good place where the decision is easy, but you're finding browser settings in multiple places. Again, it depends on your scenario.
Yeah, and it also
on the Apple, right? Sorry, Jim.
No, go ahead, Neil.
I was going to say is on the Apple side, settings catalog is how we are enabling declarative device management. So declarative device management is Apple's next iteration of MDM, and we'll enable that by settings catalog first, right? So then we'll go back and retrofit that to templates where we need to. So just going to echo John's comment, really, that settings catalog first. If you can't find it in there, do it somewhere else. But ultimately, configure this stuff where it makes sense to you to do it, right? So wherever, I think it kind of almost comes down to which teams are looking after which config, and once you've done something and tested it and it works, do it there, right? That's cool, that's fine, right? So but as a general rule, settings catalog first, and then the rest. But certainly for the non-Windows side of the house, that's what we tend to do.
Yeah, you said something that where I was going is wherever the team does it from. So you can, if it's a security setting that you can set in Intune, your security team doesn't have to give you access to security.microsoft.com consoles, right? So it depends, using our back. And so we might have several places to do something for that reason. So you don't need access to a full console. You just need access to a node to do some work. I'd love to just close this out again. It was a great time, great, 4 hours. It flew by for me. And I saw a lot of you in session after session after session. So I hope it was a lot of good information. I'm going to start with Perla and then John and then Neil. If you want to give some parting words, any cool tips, tricks, or just, say goodbye, anything you want. Perla?
Just want to say that thank you for the opportunity to answer any questions that you all have in terms of the audience. It's really great to see the progression that a lot of enterprises are doing, and a lot of things are coming into Intune, and the engineering team is hearing you and your feedback, and we're working that to prioritize the items that we need to. And then a lot of exciting things are coming, so stay tuned.
Thanks, Perla. John?
Yep. Feedback is a gift. We love your feedback. Please submit your feedback to us through forums like this, through the Intune feedback portal, through the send a smile or send a frown. If you don't like something, please share your feedback. We love to hear from you.
And Neil?
I'd just like to leave you with one thing, and that is, if you're doing Mac work, we're investing heavily in our Mac capabilities and our Mac platform. Please come and join us at our new community, and I'm going to keep calling it new, even though we announced it in May. There's a new community for us called the Microsoft Mac Admin. So head on over to there. There's a blog as well. So if you search for the Microsoft Mac Admins blog, it will tell you how to join. You send us an email, and I'll get you added to the community. So thank you very much.
Yep, it's aka.ms/Mac admins. And my parting words were going to be, I can't believe Neil went an entire session without talking about aka.ms Mac admins. The last one I want to mention to you all, if you're not a member of our Customer Connection Program, you can join the CCP Customer Connection Program at aka.ms join CCP. That's coming right up. aka.ms join CCP Customer Connection Program. You get a sneak peek at some of the cool things that Pearl is talking about that we're creating, and would love to see you there. Again, thank you all for my SMEs here. Thank you all for the attendance, and we will see you at the next Tech Community Live if we don't see you before then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.